Well, let me say hello to a couple of people. Alex Torres, he was a former speechwriter for President Trump. And my good friend and former co-author, Joshua Charles. He is also a former White House speechwriter, and he is the co-author of Original Argument, the Federalist Case for the Constitution, adapted for the 20th century, which is something we put out. I don't even know. Joshua, how long ago was that? That was 2008? 9?
2011. That was over 12
really?
years ago, Glenn.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Crazy.
Thank you again for the opportunity. It did a lot of things. Thank you.
You're extraordinarily talented. So, guys, tell me, and I guess, Alec, if you want to start, tell me about Persecuted from Within.
Yeah, Persecuted from Within is a book that's really rooted in something that Josh and I were noticing, that if you're a good, faithful, traditional Catholic, even just a good, faithful, traditional Christian, all around you, you're under attack. People don't like you. The state doesn't like you. And frankly, we saw in our own church, a lot of people in our church don't like us, and they're trying to crush us. So we wanted to know how to respond to that. We wanted to figure out, how do you act as a good Christian, a good person of faith, in response to institutions that you love persecuting you. And we thought of no better way to do that than to look at great historical figures, really monumental Christians from the past who had to live under pretty terrible circumstances, frankly, circumstances that are oftentimes worse than our own, and learn the lesson straight from them.
You cover one of my favorite guys, Fulton Sheen, the Archbishop from New York, who I didn't know about growing up. I found out about him probably in 2008, and I just think he's one of the greatest guys ever. I don't think of him as persecuted, but he's a part of the book. How do you look at him, and what did you learn from him?
Well, he was persecuted in a way that was a little hidden. What happened with him was that his cardinal at the time, it was just this interpersonal dispute. Bishop Sheen was in charge of distributing charity to the poor, and Spellman gave him a bunch of dry milk from the government that he got for free to distribute to the poor. And when Spellman asked Sheen to pay for it, and Sheen said no. So, you think it's a small matter, but it actually made the cardinal livid against Sheen, and he vowed revenge. Moved him out of his position, cut him off from his TV program, and sent him off to work in Rochester, where he was totally ill-suited for his role. But he had to do it because it was his boss, essentially. He was under the cardinal, and he had to submit. So he looked like this great figure, really had a golden touch, media personality, invited to these big events in New York, and then boom, pretty much a failure when he was sent over to Rochester, all because he refused to take money from the poor and give it to his boss. Joshua, you're having this persecution. A lot of people are questioning the way their churches are behaving because we're in a time of great change, and I think most of our churches have gotten fat and sassy and, are too timid to take on the real gospel truth and how it applies in our lives. And so a lot of people in a lot of faiths are having this problem. In the Catholic Church, you just had something unheard of happen here in Texas, where the Pope got involved and kicked somebody out.
Yeah, Bishop Strickland, who is actually a friend of mine. Wow. Right before COVID, I was able to spend some time with Bishop Strickland in what we Catholics call Eucharistic adoration, where we pray before what we believe is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord in the Eucharist. And we did that for what's called a holy hour. And I'll just say the bishop's the real deal. We went to dinner. He wears his garments everywhere he goes. He's a humble shepherd of the Lord. And I think in his reaction to the situation, we see how many of the saints that Alec and I write about in this book reacted. And we cover about 2,000 years worth of saints. And Bishop Strickland has asked Catholics, he's asked them pray for Pope Francis. He's asked them to not engage in reviling, but he's also spoken the truth about some of the issues that are going on in the church. And frankly, that's the sort of behavior that many of the saints engaged in this book. One that comes to mind is St. Athanasius, who was a great bishop of Alexandria. He was reviled and booted from his diocese multiple times. He was exiled 5 times from Alexandria. There was one time some soldiers were coming to pick him up that had been sent by the emperor, who was coordinating with some Arian bishops, and he just barely made it out. He basically covered his face and snuck through a crowd and escaped. And so there's some pretty harrowing stories. And Athanasius the phrase was Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. And he found support in Rome and in other parts of the world, particularly in the West. But he stood firmly for the truth, unwaveringly. But to do so, he had to experience persecution from within the family, as we say. And that's one of the great lessons of these saints, is that to follow Jesus says we must take up our cross, and the cross includes not only being attacked from external enemies, pagans and heathens and whatnot, but from members of the family, so to speak, within the church as well, as Jesus himself was, from Judas and the denial of Peter, and many of the problems that the apostles addressed in the early church. There's all sorts of issues. Those issues have never changed, but many of these great saints face, as Alec mentioned, challenges that many of us couldn't even imagine. I think we're in a very trying time period, don't get me wrong, but many of them, Joan of Arc, for example, she's covered in this book. She was a lay woman, and she was killed. She was unjustly brought to a trial. Her canonical rights to appeal to the Pope, for example, were denied. And as a result, she was executed. But she went to her execution faithful, praying to God, and she remained Catholic. And so, that's the great story of these saints, is that they do things that are quite literally otherworldly. And I think that's what was so inspiring. It's like either this Christianity thing is a complete fraud, or it's otherworldly, and it actually gives its followers something that they could never give themselves, and that's this peace, and that's this sense of fortitude in the face of extraordinary persecution. And the saints, by engaging in this, by suffering it, they find the humility that ultimately takes us to heaven, frankly. So
I was just talking to Megan Kelly, and I don't think that, I could be wrong, but I don't think that you guys wrote this because of the persecution that's going on right now. I have a feeling that you're thinking that it's going to get much, much worse. I could be wrong, and I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So Megan and I were talking about, what's coming. They put Donald Trump in jail or whatever. There is going to be a moment where people have had enough, and when that happens, persecution and the government will just come down hard. So what is the things that we can pull from your book that tells us what to do and what not to do?
I think when we're facing, a lot of institutions turning against us, perhaps most terrifyingly our government here in America, because the amount of power that it has, and we've seen attacks on religious people, especially Catholics, even just within the past few weeks, frankly. It's holding on to the truth, especially the truth of our faith, matters more than anything else. That gives strength that can overcome any of these difficulties. When other people are crumbling or being manipulated or falling to the wayside, it's our faith that allows us to be able to get through even grave difficulties and circumstances we've really never had to experience in our generations and make it through in the end. The saints, time and time again, when it looked like their circumstances were dire, when they themselves were imprisoned or martyred or, shut up away from the public sphere without, had their rights to speak, their liberties taken away from them, they really did cling to their faith, and God saw them through. That's what's so wonderful about these stories. You think looking at the history of persecution of great Christians would be a depressing subject, but in a way it's actually quite inspiring because you can see their strength and how we can imitate that. And you can see how God is always with his people. When you're faithful to God, God is faithful in greater abundance than we could ever know.
What do you guys think we're facing, especially as Catholics? You guys are, we have a Catholic president, only the second time in history. Last time we had one and the first time was JFK. And now we have a Catholic president who seems to be going after the Catholics. It's bizarre.
Well, Glenn, this is a topic I've been pondering for really since COVID. I came into the Catholic Church in July 2019, and then so my first Easter was in 2020. And, we know that was a somewhat eventful year. Mm-hmm. And masses around the world were canceled for Easter. And what I discovered in the church fathers and in many of these great saints is this articulation of this idea, as I said before, that persecution comes not only from the outside but from within. And as we all know, those of us who've had any family issues, which I'm sure is pretty much all of us, that's the hardest thing to deal with. But that's exactly what these saints dealt with. And frankly, President Biden, I hope he repents. I hope he comes back to the faith. He's clearly violating it. And frankly, we have many shepherds who aren't calling him on it. And they'll be held to a very high standard at the day of judgment. We Catholics believe that every single one of us will have to answer for what we did and what we failed to do to Jesus Christ at the day of judgment. And the people who have the highest standard for behavior will be bishops, will be priests, and will be the Pope. And, the Pope has to go to confession. Bishops have to go to confession. And to the extent that they fail to amend their conduct before they die, they're going to have to answer to the biggest boss. And so, but what we saw with all these saints, the subtitle of the book is called How the Saints Endured Crises in the Church. And I will say that there is this idea that there's this Judas element within the church throughout its entire history. It can't go away. It will be resolved, but when Jesus comes back, and Jesus warned about it, the apostles warned about it, some have called it the anti-church, and it's basically this dark side of the church. And these saints exhibit an astounding level of humility when they're faced with this kind of persecution. So, for example, I joked with some of my White House colleagues that the thing that sucks about being Catholic is we can't complain about suffering. And what I meant is there's this idea in the Catholic faith of redemptive suffering. And the idea is that through his cross, prior to the Lord's cross and his death and resurrection, suffering was basically meaningless. It was just futile. It was the effect of the fall and whatnot. But after the cross, every single human being, if they follow Christ, can join their suffering to his, and it becomes fruitful. It becomes fruitful for the salvation of others. It becomes fruitful for the salvation of their own soul. And so literally everything that would have been futile and meaningless, which suffering oftentimes feels like, through Christ and his suffering, becomes meaningful. And that's what so many of these saints show. Stephen Colbert, I don't think he's the most, the paradigm of an Orthodox Catholic per se, but he had this beautiful line in an interview with Anderson Cooper, where Anderson Cooper was mentioning all these horrible tragedies that happened to him. And he basically said, how'd you get through it? And Stephen Colbert said that in the Catholic faith, God does it too. And that's essentially what you see in the lives of all these saints with Athanasius and St. Thomas More. And they were laymen, they were priests, they were bishops, they were monks and nuns. So they come from all sorts of walks of life. Sometimes they're having to criticize popes. Sometimes they're having to be persecuted by their bishops or their cardinals, as Alec talked about with Venerable Fulton Sheen. Sometimes they're literally being executed, or like St. Joan of Arc, or they're being exiled from their diocese and on the run, like St. Athanasius. So they're dealing with all these things, but they know they can join their sufferings to Christ. And these saints, to this day, we believe are in heaven, praying for all of us, reaping the most possible fruit a human being can ever reap for the salvation of the world. And that's what their suffering did by joining it to Christ.
Joshua, thank you so much. Alex, the same. The name of the book is Persecuted from Within, written for Catholics, but I don't think it's probably just for Catholics. It is for everybody. And I think we all need to look at how we are going to behave in times of persecution, because I do believe it is coming. Again, Persecuted from Within. Thank you so much, guys. God bless.